Hi, it's Blasberg. I am here in Paris, France for Zara Talks, and I'm about to speak to Marc Newson. What's up, Marc?
Hey, Derek.
No one told us to go. Are we going? We're going. Is it time to go? All right, let's do this. Marc Newson, please sit there while I talk about you briefly for a moment. Marc Newson's diverse and innovative industrial design embraces everything from furniture and fine art to transportation and timepieces. He's a pioneer celebrated for his boundary-defying approaches to materials, techniques, and processes, and Newson's signature aesthetic, one preoccupied by soft edges, purity of form, and bold color, has led to some of the most iconic works of design in the modern era. Newson is represented in museum collections around the world and continues to influence the direction of global design. His broad range of clients include LVMH, Hermes, Ferrari, Jaeger-LeCoultre, and Nike, as well as specialty commissions for residences and yachts, as well as directing his own London-based studio. Newson has held significant roles as designer for special projects at Apple, a role which saw his involvement in the design of the Apple Watch. In 2019, Marc and Sir Jonathan Ive founded the creative collective Loveform. Thank you, Marc, for being here today for Zara Talks. I think everyone has been upstairs. In this project, Marc created glazed tumbler, we call them glasses or vases. We were debating, how shall we identify them?
They're definitely drinking glasses.
That
was my intention.
But I could also put a flower in there.
Yeah, you could put a flower.
Vividly beautiful glasses showcase the designer's signature preoccupation with saturated color and purity of form. They are sold in matching color sets in 3 sizes, were produced through traditional hand-blown processes by artisans in La Granja, one of Spain's most established glassmaking workshops, and they reflect Newson's vision for tethering industrial design to craft heritage techniques. There you are.
Thank you.
Thank you. So Marc, growing up in Sydney to become one of the world's most influential designers, was there a moment when you realized you wanted to do this for a living? What was the epiphany?
The epiphany, if there was one, it was more like a sort of series of mini epiphanies rather than one overwhelming epiphany. Was during my childhood, really, wanting to come up with sort of solutions to things that I wasn't really happy with. I mean, design in general for me is today largely inspired by what I don't like, as opposed to, one could even say sort of, negative responses to things. But if everything was kind of perfect out there, I'd be out of a job.
And that was from your childhood. You were already identifying stuff you didn't like even then.
Yeah, things that I didn't like, or things that irritated me, or things that I wanted.
What irritated a young Marc Newson?
Kind of everything, actually. I was never really happy with things that I could, I was going to say that I could buy, but I couldn't buy because we couldn't afford most of the things that I would have wanted. So I was largely left to kind of conceive and think of how I would create things, the kinds of things that I might want to own and use, even at a very, very early age, long before I knew what design was.
And before you knew what design was, you studied something completely different at university. I discovered this when we had a drink last week. You studied silver, no?
Yeah, I studied well, first of all, I didn't study design. So when I graduated from high school, I ended up going to art school because really I couldn't figure out what else to do, and they accepted me, which was in itself a kind of major accomplishment. And then I started to learn how to make jewelry and started to become a jeweler. Learned the technical skills of how to become a jeweler and a silversmith, and did that for a couple of years.
When did your signature curves and soft edges, when did that aesthetic become something that you wanted to focus on?
That aesthetic, the sort of brightly colored, organic kind of, for want of a better definition, vibe really started in I guess in my early 20s in Australia, you know, when I was kind of learning how to make things, when I started making furniture actually, because furniture was the first thing that I started like designing, you know, if we think about design in a contemporary sense. And, you know, I was doing that with brightly colored materials and sort of soft forms that I think were largely inspired by where I came from Sydney, you know, in Australia. You know, popular culture was really surf culture. You know, the place was bright, you know, color was everywhere. You know, color was in the light. You couldn't avoid color in Australia. So.
You're known for being hands-on. So in those early days of creating the first pieces of furniture, is that when you started workshopping the process, and do you still use that process today?
Yes, well, the skills that I learned when I was becoming a jeweler, learning how to be a jeweler and a silversmith, really set me up very well in terms of being able to make things. You know, I only ever wanted to sort of build things, but not for the sake of building things or making things. It was really a means to an end. You know, I couldn't afford, or I didn't have the means available to go and have other people do it for me. So I was left with pretty much doing everything for myself, by myself, you know, with the means that were available to me at the time. So I didn't want necessarily to make things. It was just the only way I could do it.
Has the ability to scale things and mass produce, has that affected the way that you create and design in your process, or?
You know, mass production for me, has ended up being a very, very linear sort of evolution from making things by hand. You know, it's really great to know how to build things and to make things. Not only is it a practical skill, but it enables you to have kind of meaningful dialogue with potential manufacturers. So all of those things that you learn and that you most of the time even teach yourself mean that you can, you know, I wanted to have things manufactured. It was always my intention. You know, I never wanted to make one or two of something, but I couldn't afford to make any more. But then I could go to manufacturers in the early days, rather than present them with a design on paper, I could take a real thing that I built, right? And that was a far more convincing, you know, it was a more sort of compelling argument, so to speak.
You've designed everything from everyday objects to luxury pieces to aircrafts. How do you approach different scales and different contexts?
Yeah, I think, you know, I might be one of a few people that work across such a broad range of objects, but a broad range of scales as well. You know, I'm sort of slightly obsessed still with the notion of jewelry and watches, small objects on that scale.
Are you wearing 2 watches now? What's on the other side?
Oh, that's a medical device.
Right.
That's a watch, but that's an old watch that I designed. I used to have I started a watch company back in the mid-90s, but that's another story. But I love, you know, what I learned doing small things sort of grew into doing big things. It's much easier to start small and grow than to start big and get smaller. Like, I think it's much more difficult for architects to sort of design small things than it is for...
Right.
But okay, that's just my opinion.
No, and the same thing happens, I think, in literature. You know, Truman Capote famously said it's easier to write 10,000 words than 1,000 words. So I think sometimes the smaller objects are more intense.
Yeah. In any case, scale is a notion or a concept that fascinates me. You know, I love the idea of being able to move from small to big, and still apply the same sort of methodology or logic to anything, whether it's really tiny or really big, and apply the same level of attention and detail. You know, just because something's really big doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be sort of sloppier.
You've worked with brands including Apple and Louis Vuitton. Today we're here with Zara. What excites you about each new partnership?
Working with different people with new people, having new partnerships is exciting. I guess for want of a better expression, I'm a kind of gun for hire. I mean, that's pretty much how my career has been up until now. So I rely and live and sort of benefit from working on new projects and tackling new challenges, solving new problems. So I'm also a kind of problem solver. I think designers are inherently, good designers or functional designers are problem solvers. So new challenges, new problems are what I do.
I saw you last night when we were looking at all of the other projects. Did you know immediately you wanted to do these glasses, or how did you interpret the brief when Zara asked you to do something today?
The brief was very, very broad, as you could imagine by seeing all of the breadth of different types of objects here. So the brief, with all respect to Marta, wasn't that helpful. No. Yeah, no, but it was great. It was open. So
they said do whatever you want, right?
Basically, yeah. Yeah. Do whatever you want, but it's always caveated by, well, at least it caveated by myself, in the sense that it needs to be sort of, on some level, needs to live in a real world, and have some notion of sort of being realistically manufactured, or it can't be. For me, something completely theoretical wasn't appropriate for this collaboration.
The tumblers play with they are opaque in unexpected ways. Can you tell us about the creative journey with Zara and the Spanish artisans who created the glasses?
Well, once I had come up with a kind of an idea, and that was largely sort of hatched during the summer in Greece, in the sun, drinking. You can
now
imagine.
I understand. Now I understand the glasses.
Then it was, like many things that I work on, almost everything. It very quickly, that's the kind of easy part. Then it very quickly becomes about, how do you do it, and where do we do it, and what are the skills, and what's the expertise that we need to exploit to make this happen. And that's where, when the opportunity became apparent that we could work with this facility in Spain, it kind of became really exciting all of a sudden. So it's generally a lot about that. Things don't become realistic or exciting until I can see a light at the end of the tunnel, and that generally has to do with the sort of pragmatic aspects of realizing something. But these guys in Spain, La Granja, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it.
Are we saying that right, La Granja? It doesn't feel right.
La Granja,
it doesn't feel right.
Sorry.
It doesn't feel Spanish when I say it.
Sorry. No, this is a cooperative that's existed for 250 years. Deeply rooted in where they come from and with what the expertise that they have. So that in itself is an exciting proposal.
The aluminum carbon. This question's more about exploring new materials, and I remember that we talked about, with your work with Ferrari, a lot of the materials that were used in the past are no longer available. How often does the availability of textures and textiles, and how often does that change, and how does that affect what you do?
I think for me it's really largely about what's appropriate in terms of solving that particular problem. The thing that I love about glass as a material, and that's the material that I've used in this situation, is that it's completely timeless, right? I mean, it obviously clearly has stood the test of time and will for an infinite amount of time in the future. So it's a really difficult material to work with. It's sort of fluid in ways that's difficult to express, but the purity of the material is extremely seductive and appealing.
What I love about this project is that there are so many obvious connections, which, Marc, you see often, through design, fashion. How do you see design and fashion inspiring each other in your own life and career?
It's a good question. Design, fashion, music, film, architecture, all of those things I think are important. Popular culture has influenced me and continues to influence me in a really profound way. Fashion being at the sort of the extreme, at the sort of sharp end of that collection of things. The thing that I love about fashion is that it's relatively fast. At the other end of the spectrum, you have something like architecture or, the work that I do in the marine industry. You have projects that go for 5 years. So being exposed to the fashion world is not only inspiring, but it's reassuring, actually, that that there are people and there are entities that can do things, in a relatively short period of time and can reinvent themselves, seasonally, because that's in the design world, that's not common at all. So I think it's really important to be conscious and to have a kind of to keep your finger on the pulse with that stuff and to be interested in it and not to dismiss it.
Last week, Marc designed the set at the Fendi show in Milan, which was sort of a primary color, pixelated mosh pit sort of thing. I think that was that's probably not how you described it, but that's how I described it. And I imagine they built that, a day before, and then they took it out the day after? Fashion is very quick.
Yeah, it's a great example. We conceived of this idea for a set for a fashion show in Milan, in an enormous space that's 100 meters long, right? And it was 2 months ago, and then the thing gets realized literally in a matter of weeks. That's a sort of an inconceivable proposition, or an accomplishment in my books. But yet it happens not just once, but it happens
4 times a year. Yeah, it happens.
Yeah, and many times every season, right?
Yeah.
So it's just kind of mind-boggling and reassuring. It's fun. It's great to know that can be done.
As we look into the future, how do you see the role of designed objects evolving in our daily lives? For example, there was a time when we all had a phone, a camera, and a watch, right? And now one device does that all. How do you see the role of designed objects impacting our daily lives?
I guess it's safe to say that the world of design, it feels like it's impacting our daily lives on a more profound level. That at least we become more and more conscious of this thing called design. What that actually is, I'm not entirely sure. But yes, I think on many levels it's more design is more profound, in terms of its influence on our daily lives. On the other hand, it's always been there as well. Everything's always been designed. We just never associated a personality with it, or so. That's also an important sort of distinction to recognize. But design is a bit different now. It's certainly more sophisticated. The level of choice, because ultimately it's all about choice, right? I wouldn't say that what I'm doing is improving, the world of design at large. I'm simply offering more choice to people with maybe a slightly different taste level.
A better choice, I'll say it.
Maybe for some people, yeah.
You're known for collecting watches and appreciating mechanical craftsmanship. What makes an object worth treasuring for decades rather than just seasons?
Now we get to the discussion about luxury, which is everyone's favorite sort of horrible definition. I think it's simply about creating objects that won't end up as landfill, maybe, for me. I love the idea that you buy something and you could have it for a long time. You could maybe even have it forever. Maybe you could even, pass it on to future generations, like that cheesy watch, ad,
Yeah.
But Yeah, that for me is the sort of definition of quality, something that lives, can last, and can be repaired. You know, that there's a sense of, you know, kind of mechanical complexity in the sense that it could be dismantled, put back together. Yeah, so.
Marc, this will be my last question. What I loved about this Zara project is that it really was, you know, anything you want in the world of Zara. Is there any fantasy project, if you could do anything, what would it be?
Anything for Zara?
Anything for anyone.
Anything for anyone, wow.
What's the Marc Newson fantasy?
Golly, I mean, I've done a lot of stuff, a lot of different things, and I've been asked that question before. I think one area of interest I have, where I've only had a little bit of exposure, is you know, designing stuff for sort of not terrestrial environments, like, you know.
We're going to space.
In space, right?
Ah.
Yeah. I did a project a while ago for aerospace and defense company for the design of a suborbital spacecraft, and it was really fascinating. You know, when you start to kind of get off the Earth.
That would take passengers to space?
Yeah, that would take...
The Marc Newson spaceship?
Yeah, and sadly never happened, but...
Why didn't you ask Marta if we could do that for Zara? Maybe for the 100th. For the 100th.
Yeah, we might all be there by then anyway. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you for today. I hope everyone had a lovely time.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Derek.